So we studied the French Enlightenment. Now we're going to turn then from the French Enlightenment to the German Enlightenment. And in the German Enlightenment, we're going to see that there are various phases. We can see representatives of certain phases culminating in Immanuel Kant at the end of this class. So the first phase is best represented by persons like Christian Thomasius. Thomasius was born in 1655, died in 1728. So we see the end of the 17th and early 18th centuries as Thomasius. Thomasius then he said that the French are philosophically superior to the Germans. Why? Because the Germans tend to dwell on metaphysical abstractions. The French tend to be like our friends in Britain, basing what they say on what they see and hear based on the senses. The Germans instead tend to go off on these metaphysical abstractions like God and the soul and substance and heaven, etc. He said, metaphysics does not yield real knowledge. Where does real knowledge come from? Science and the senses. Right? Metaphysics does not yield real knowledge. He says the value of philosophy then lies in its utility. Philosophy is valuable insofar as it contributes to the social good or the common good and or to the individual's happiness. Your philosophy is good if it leads to happiness. He saw philosophy as an instrument of progress. So instead of dwelling on these metaphysical sorts of things, no, we should be using our philosophy to bring progress to this world. He said the hostility toward metaphysics is grounded in empiricism. Why are people opposed to metaphysics? Because this is where they're basing their worldview in empiricism. He said the mind must be purified of all prejudices and preconceptions, especially those of Aristotelianism and scholasticism. Scholasticism did a lot to build up theology and metaphysics. Not so good. Time for us to get back to science and to empiricism. So Thomasius suggested that our knowledge depends on our senses, like a good empiricist, right? Your knowledge comes from your senses. We have no innate ideas. We're born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And we can't discover truths about the world by a purely deductive method. We discover truths of the world through our senses. Experience and observation are the only trustworthy sources of our knowledge. Where does our knowledge come from? The best sources are going to be your experience and your senses. He says the bounds of knowledge are determined by the senses. How much can you know? Well, how much can you see and hear and take in through your senses? That's as much as you can know. The dependence of our minds on sense perception shows the emptiness of metaphysical speculation. Why should we not be dwelling here? Because everything that has come into your mind has come in through the senses. So let's focus there on what's come into you through the senses, not on these abstractions. But he was a good Lutheran. He was a pietist Lutheran, and so he tended to emphasize personal faith and one's interior experience over other things like being in one's head and thinking through metaphysical notions. Thomasius suggested that our highest good is tranquility, peace of the soul, and the way to that peace or tranquility is pointed out by reason. He said if reason doesn't dominate in our lives and in our world, then we live in a mixed state of war and peace. If we were reasonable people, there would be no war in this world. He said rational reflection must direct us to securing the longest and happiest life possible. This is interesting because his theory was that there are three things that motivate people. Three things motivate people, and those three things are the desire to live a long and happy life, the desire to flee from death and pain, and thirdly, the desire for property and mastery. And so, our rational reflection has to direct us in securing the longest and happiest life possible because that's something that we all desire as human beings. He articulated at least three principles. The principle of justice. So this is going to be principles of ethics that are not based in the Bible or theology. Let's just think through Okay, how can we live good, happy lives? First of all, there's the principle of justice. The principle of justice says, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Interesting, okay? So we don't need the Bible that tells us right and wrong. Let's come up with principles ourselves. First principle is, don't do to someone else what you don't want them to do to you. That's the principle of justice. The next one, the principle of decency, slightly different. Do to others what you would want them to do to you. Ooh, that sounds almost biblical, right? The golden rule, do unto others, you have them do unto you. Okay, the principle of decency. And finally, the principle of virtue and self-respect, slightly different. Do to yourself what you would wish others to do to themselves. So we notice those are three principles that are all slightly different. Principle of justice, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. The principle of decency, do to others what you would want them to do to you. And the principle of self-respect, do to yourself what you would wish for others to do to themselves. Thomasius suggested that the individual should overcome egoistic desires and subordinate him or herself to the good of society. So it's all about the good of society, the general will, Rousseau called it.